What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and we are here with the Knull series. What this does is it picks up with Knull showing back up again. Now, here's a funny thing. Knull's been dead for a while, right? He's been out of the picture for quite some time. So the question that so many people are going to have here is, how did Knull come back? Well, the good thing is Al Ewing answers that for us here in a second. In fact, what this comic does is it starts off and it says, spawned in the abysmal dark eons past, he has been called by countless names. God of the symbiotes, God of the void, Lord of the abyss, Knull. But before the many names, before the myriad of heinous deeds that earned them, there was only the void, all-consuming, all-encompassing, a blanket of eternal darkness cloaking Knull in its cold and peaceful embrace, a paradisal kingdom of one, until the Celestials arrived, and with them, burning torturous light. These bright gods from afar deemed the void to be unfinished and barren. Knull, suddenly roused from his infinite slumber, found himself in a waking nightmare, watching as the Celestials set out to construct that which need not be constructed, to fill that which not need be filled. The living void was Knull's home, his kingdom, and he refused to surrender it without a fight. Now, for those of you guys who are unfamiliar with this, right, Knull's origin, which is to say where he comes from, is actually a subject of debate among the fan base within Marvel Comics, because there's seemingly the idea that he comes from what's called the Yawning Void, or the Far Shore, but basically the place beyond all of existence, and essentially the home and realm of Oblivion. Whereas if we look at King in Black issue number 1, that story establishes that Knull originated between the 6th version of the main Marvel Universe and the 7th version of the main Marvel Universe. The cool thing about this storyline is that it's going to reconcile that information and close and really bring an end to a lot of these debates that are going on out there about the nature of the character, specifically in relation to Oblivion. And so what ends up happening is it continues on. Wielding a living sword, forged from the blood fires of a fallen celestial, Knull set out across the universe to push back against the encroaching light. Over time, the sword, like its creator, became known by many names: the Necro Sword, the God Slayer, All Black, and so it was until a golden knight brandishing All Light, a spear possessed of powers contrary to those of All Black, fought Knull to a debilitating impasse as the cosmic foes lay locked in their eternal death pose on the befouled soil of a nameless planet. All Black was stolen, destined to write legends in the blood of dead gods in the hands of another. Of course, this is referencing Gore the God Butcher, but it actually doesn't really reference him a lot, at least not at this point in time. Instead, we kind of go on with Knull's story, where it says while the enigmatic spear was seemingly forgotten forever, in time, Knull would rise again, regaining All Black and ruling over a symbiote horde created from his own living abyss, perpetually bonded by a hive mind to become a new, perverted kingdom of one. The symbiotes became feared across the grand expanse of time and space, spreading Knull's dark influence even after they turned on him. Now, this is actually a misnomer, and I think this kind of needs to be corrected, but we'll talk about that here in a second, because it says ultimately drawing him to planet Earth to face her greatest heroes in his endless war against the forces of light. But that was then. Of course, that's referencing the actual King in Black event, when he shows up on Earth with the Celestials in tow and goes to war against Earth's superheroes. But to the point about the symbiotes turning on him and then continuing his dark deeds, they kind of did for a time. But the reality here is that what ended up happening is there was a point when Knull was defeated and essentially had his connection to the All Black cut. And when that happened, the symbiotes began operating of their own accord, and they slowly began bonding to benevolent people out there, essentially good guys. And so when that happened, the symbiotes developed a moral compass, and so they basically became the agents of the cosmos, while at the same time locking Knull away within the planet Clentar. So there's a little more to it than simply just they kept carrying on his actions after he was defeated. In fact, they didn't. They kind of went the other direction, truth to tell. But focusing on the here and now, as this story goes, it says, "This is now behold, the king in black. And you have this guy who's just taunting Knull, right? Not much to look at, are you? And kind of going back and forth with him, making fun of him, talking about how he's a caged animal, right? Like Knull hisses at him and he taunts him over the fact that he's being hissed at and so on and so forth. But Knull addresses him, right? And he says, silly fool, do you believe this to be the first cage to hold me captive? Compared to Clintar, this is nothing more than a shoddy magician's stage prop, like your false bravado lacking any true substance, merely for show. And when I escape this slapdash prison, and I will, you will see how much I despise such speciousness. I will paint the entire universe with the dark ichor of my victims, and your rancid blood will be the first I dip into my brush. That's probably one of the coldest things that I think I've ever heard a villain say. Truth to tell, right? But again, this guard just doesn't really take him seriously. He even goes so far as to mock him, right? About how he has his own razor-sharp spear and that kind of thing. But then that's when a voice comes out of nowhere and says, perhaps you should avoid tempting such foolhardy danger by standing so close to our special guest while donning one of his symbiote children soldier. Besides, it is you who should not forget that we owe him so much, because it's Hela who's holding him prisoner. And she says, now, be gone. The good general and I require some privacy with our new friend. And so this is the crazy thing, right? Because on the surface, what this does is it gives the appearance that Al Ewing is going in the direction of making Hela as strong and powerful as she was back in like the 70s and 80s in Marvel Comics. For those of you guys who don't know what that means, Asgardians were considered just cracked, super overpowered back in the 1970s and 80s, and even to a degree in the early 90s, but really more back during the classic age of Marvel, because they were effectively gods. And so being called a god carried a lot more weight. It was different than what it is now, where it's almost a ceremonial title, as opposed to like an actual significant thing within the Marvel universe. Because what ends up happening here is when she starts addressing Knull, right, he says, and I trust that you will squeal like a butchered sow, Hela, as I rip the porcine heart from your breast. And so she ultimately goes in to touch him, right, to grab him, and snaps his arm with her bare hands, something she should not be able to do. Right, Hela is incredibly capable, she's incredibly powerful, but powerful enough to break the arm of Knull with her bare hand, seemingly giving no effort whatsoever? No, she is not on that level. But Knull continues to taunt her, right, like, I am going to kill all of you, right? And she says, ambitious yet doubtful. And so they kind of continue on, because she asks Tyr directly, what do you know about Knull? And this is where a lot of those shifts begin to come into play. He says, he is a thing of the void, my lady, like cursed oblivion, who laid me low in Asgard's eyes and my own. But that's where Hela says, not quite, right? She says, oblivion is the great end of all things that Knull wishes to be. Oblivion is the Ur-Divisor who sits equal to the living tribunal. And she says, right, oblivion is the void itself. Knull is, as you so correctly stated, only of it, and he exists now only on a technicality. So that's an important statement to make here, because ever since Knull had come around, there's always been this argument in saying that he was like an avatar of Oblivion, or represented Oblivion in some capacity. And metaphorically, absolutely, right? If Oblivion represents what it means to end all things, and Knull looks to seek the destruction of all things to bring an end to light and life and return the universe back to a place of permanent and perpetual darkness, then he and Oblivion stand together. But there is a vast difference between representing an idea and existing as a product of that idea, which is to say Oblivion creating Knull and saying, go forth, my child, and kill everyone. There's a big difference there, right? And so that's where you continue on with Knull, where he just kind of continues on. I'll slaughter every last one of you, right? Continuing to go back and forth and back and forth. But then Hela starts to fill us in a little bit more. And she says, it was at the dawn of the cosmos when the Celestials chose Knull to serve as the King in Black, a role he held until he so imprudently attacked the champions of Midgard, ultimately forfeiting his reign to the Venom host of that time, the human called Eddie Brock, when Brock incinerated him in the sun, but Brock's time as the King in Black was brief, lost through a combination of misadventure and self-sabotage. This, of course, all referencing a combination of the King in Black story and Al Ewing's own Venom run. But Hela says, this created an imbalance in the universe, a great void in the machinery of creation that the universe was forced to correct. And the god of the void is Knull. And she says, ironic, really, when nobody is King in Black, you return, Knull, because you, empty space, are the greatest nobody of all. And that's what's kind of crazy, because it's basically Al Ewing kind of rewriting, or not really rewriting, but kind of expanding and reworking his own story. That normally there's always a King in Black, right? And traditionally it is Eddie Brock. But in Eddie Brock no longer being the King of Black, Knull will always return to fill that role. So it's Al Ewing basically saying he can always come back, right? There's always a way for him to come back, even if he dies. And so that's where Hela says, but Knull returned weakened, right? A wisp of something that once was, a void conjured merely to fill a void. Still, if he'd remembered that Asgard existed, he might have known to avoid my snares, but none of Midgard do, not even Knull. So outside his sight, I gathered the threads of fate in my grip and bound him with them, and now his strength returns to me, because what she's doing is siphoning off his energy as it continually comes back for him, right, as his power grows. Now, to the idea that Midgard does not remember Asgard, that was from Immortal Thor issue number 25. It was basically a trick at the hands of both Loki and Thor, but really more Loki, where in essence, Asgard was cut off from Midgard. So essentially, all the realms that exist out there within the main Marvel universe. And so it even went so far as this idea that Thor basically just kind of became a legend, right, a myth, and that it is now known, as far as the universe is concerned, Beta Ray Bill was a founding member of the Avengers instead of Thor. Now, Thor's story is still going on, is taking place in the Mortal Thor. I will cover it, right, but it's basically the myth of Thor as opposed to Thor as the actual god on Earth. But again, one of the things that Hela points out here is that Knull's power is actually coming back at a much slower rate than expected. And in fact, she says that, right? Less dark energy than before. It appears that you are starting to outlive your usefulness, god of nothingness, but perhaps that will be your final escape, becoming nothing again. And so that's where Knull begins to sit down and think about the nature of his powers. And that's where we start to learn he's actually got new powers, or at least he's able to tap into a new power, right? Because he keeps repeating the word nothing, and he says the Asgardian wench is right. I am nothing. I am the void, the great absence, time to prove it. And he vanishes. And so as soon as the guard comes back in, looking to taunt Knull once more, when the guard opens the door, Knull ultimately escapes, right? And Knull kind of starts speaking to him, and he says, what's going on here is not a trick, right? But you were still correct. The cage was empty, and I am the great emptiness. When the cage was empty, I was in the cage, but the room was empty too. So Knull literally transported out of the cage and into the room, and then immediately tears this guy's head off. No pun intended. It is a literal act, and then just starts siphoning off everything from this guy. And he says, right, yes, that's it. Return to me, my child, away from this insignificant blight, right? My strength increases. And he says, death is the void of life after all, child. Every death, the end of a universe. Granted, a small universe from such an unimportant creature is that, but it will do for now. So it's just a long-winded way of saying, as he kills people, he basically takes the essence that is them, and that's how he's starting to restore his power. And it happens over and over and over again. Some guard runs up on him, Knull tears his back out. Another guard comes running up on him, Knull takes them out too. Over and over and over again, it's the exact same thing. Until finally, he finds a vessel that can be used to escape. And in fact, there's a measure of shame here, right, where he says, exactly what we need, my children. I am embarrassed to admit, I once flew across the expanse of the universe on the back of a majestic dragon of living darkness, and now I am reduced to pilfering this pitiful machine. I must regain my full strength. But how? And so that's when you switch back over to Hela, and you end up finding out Knull escaping, and her telling him that he is of the great nothing was actually designed to motivate him to escape, to motivate him to leave. That is all part of Hela's plan. And understand, Hela does this, right? She is not the one to think 1 or 2 steps ahead, not even 3 or 4. Hela plays the long game, right? 10, 15, 20, 30 steps ahead, right? She's always looking to the horizon. It doesn't mean she always wins, but she's always looking at the bigger picture when it comes to stuff like this. And so when Tyr starts questioning what the motivation is behind all of this, that yes, Knull is weaker than he used to be, but he will grow in power over time, Hela tells him, right, surely you understand that an almost queen in black is no queen in black at all, right? I must have all of Knull's power, but I cannot tear it away from him by force, not with the magics that I currently possess. He must give up the last of his dark kingdom of his own free will, and I've placed him on the path to do just that. The only move he can make in this game is one that will ensure my victory, but if it is certainty you seek, it is certainty I shall provide. Knull is a stubborn old goat. He may need a shepherd, so it's time to make a call. And she summons Thanos. Now at that point, we switch over to Thanos' ship, right? Sanctuary 5 is the current iteration of it, but on planet Feral with the Outriders. Now one of the things to know about the Outriders, and it's actually kind of specified here, the Outriders are not the biological offspring of Thanos, right? Yes, they were introduced in Infinity and all that kind of stuff, but the Outriders are basically just single-serving servants, right? For lack of a better word, which is to say, they are tasked with serving a purpose, and then once they're done with their purpose, they die, and that's really it. But they are largely stationed on planet Feral, where they just wait until they get any orders from Thanos whatsoever. But what we end up finding out here, right, Al Ewing tells us, with no remaining prey to consume, no remaining enemies to conquer, they have become like their prison planet, barren and devoid of purpose, deprived of the proper guidance to channel their violent instincts. They succumb to the madness of self-destruction. They struggle and strain against one another, heeding a burning inner drive that they can neither control nor suppress, just as their maker intended, as Thanos intended. And so that's when he jumps down into the field of them, right? And they all start attacking him, just kind of like these mindless things. They start attacking him, right, trying to kill him every chance they get, and he just starts incinerating them all with reckless abandon and extreme prejudice, right? And so that's where they end up yielding, recognizing Thanos as their master, and he simply says, now we may begin, because he is sending them on a task. And so what this does is it switches back over to Knull. And this is where things get really cool as far as this reworking of his origin goes, because he says, we are drawing nearer to our destination, my children. Sensors indicate we will arrive shortly, and diminished as I've become, it will be quite possibly the final stop on our journey, and such a frustratingly ponderous journey at that. There was a time, children, before my great fall, when the cosmic abyss, its myriad fiery stones and blazing columns, was mine to traverse in the blink of an eye, when the infinite darkness was my kingdom to rule, my only enemy, a perverse reflection of my tenebrous existence, the accursed God of Light. Now, this is one of the big retcons that came between King in Black and all that kind of stuff, right? The Al Ewing Venom run, the whole 9 yards, the idea of there being various Kings in Black, and so on and so forth. Because what happens is that Knull says, created by celestial interlopers to be my diametrical opposite, the God of Light's sole purpose was to despoil the sanctity of my living void. From the very beginning, this bodiless creature of living light cowardly infected its putrid existence into weak-minded proxies, forcing those same incarnated puppets to inject its infernal blightness into my fathomless dark. I could not, would not allow this. And so the two of them fought one another. And he says, we waged a war in heaven. For millennia, my opponent spread its light powers far and wide, relying on overwhelming numbers to destroy me, stretching its forces thin, making it a futile strategy at best, simply more for me to kill. Eventually, the God of Light realized its tactical folly, choosing instead to focus its power on a single champion, a formidable golden knight wielding a spear imbued with living brightness, the All-Light. Call it hubris, call it habit, call it what you will, but this new threat did not to sway my attack. Gripping All Black tightly in my hands, I charged headlong into battle. Unstoppable force met immovable object, shaking the heavens and shattering the cosmos. And so, both victorious, both defeated, we fell, we crashed, and there we lay, inert and senseless, on the wretched soil of a nameless planet. And that was when he came, the would-be butcher of gods. And so this is where the retcon comes into play, because this god of light that's being referred to here, this is the Enigma Force within Marvel Comics. Now, for years and years and years, the Enigma Force was exactly what it sounded like. It was this source of power that was associated with the microverse, seemingly permeated from the microverse, that would like choose hosts, and those individuals would go on to basically become Captain Universe. Now, in X-23 Volume 3, issue number 15, we actually got more of a hardline explanation on where it originated from, which is to say, it came by way of a guy named Prince Wayfinder. Prince Wayfinder came from like 15,000 years in the future. He was trying to find a way to save his people, and so he ended up bringing them back to basically Earth, but during the very early days of Earth, and then realized the planet wasn't really suitable. And so that's how the microverse was formed, and then his people were taken there. Now, there is certainly a little more to it than that, which is to say, in Micronauts issue number 31 from Bill Mantlo, the reason why, primordial Earth wasn't really habitable for Prince Wayfinder and his people is that they were attacked by a group called the World Demons. But Prince Wayfinder eventually found something called the Sword and the Star, which basically gave him the ability to defeat a foe. But what ended up happening is that when the Sword and the Star was taken by Prince Wayfinder, it bonded to him. And when that happened, the Enigma Force was formed. So that's the original origin for it, right? You can find a lot of that between like Marvel Preview issue number 4 and Micronauts issue number 31 going into issue number 35 back in 1981. But the bigger point is that more recently, all of that has been changed. This is now the new origin for the Enigma Force within Marvel Comics, right? It is a source of power created by the Celestials to be the antithesis to Knull, the symbiote god, right? Light and dark. And so at that point, you continue on with Knull's story where he talks about Gore, right? He says, Gore, the petty thief who maliciously stole All Black from my near lifeless hands. Gore, the weak, who newly transformed, cravenly absconded with my firstborn to undertake a fool's quest. Gore, the insignificant, whose nameless world we now return to. And he says, look there, children, this is where the first of your kind were formed from my own two hands after I had recovered from my battle with the Golden Knight, a dead place of dried bones and lost hopes. Paradoxical, really, that new life should originate from such a graveyard planet. And so when they end up crashing down or landing on this world, Knull, of course, emerges from the ship, but the light isn't really destructive to him, but it does harm him, right? In his weakened state, it affects him more than it traditionally would, right? And that's why he says, the light, right? It burns. I know you feel it too, my children, just as I feel you slipping away from me. Please forgive me. I do not wish your sacrifice, but I must push forward. The weapon I seek is yet here. Even in my weakened state, I sense it. We stand at death's door, children, and our last remaining chance at survival is to turn to the light. And so as he makes his way across this planet, he's met by the arrival of the outriders, and they immediately attack him, right? They've been sent there by Thanos, and they attack him with every ounce of strength they have. And that's the crazy thing about outriders, right? It's almost like when you're facing off against the Hand in Marvel Comics, right? When the Hand come for you, they come for you in droves, right? They'll send hundreds of ninjas after you, because no matter how many ninjas die, they can always resurrect them, create new ones, the whole 9 yards. The outriders are the same way, and Knull starts tearing through all these guys. But the problem is that at the end of the day, we are talking about Knull in a weakened state. At a normal level of power, this would be child's play. It wouldn't even really be much of a challenge for someone like him. But having been so weakened, it's a relatively difficult task, because while he does take out a whole bunch of them, he says, I know not where you originate from, monster, but here is where you will die. But again, more of them arrive, right? Destroy the night, villain. And they say, Father commands it. We serve, right? We all serve. And he says, as do I, creature, I serve myself. And he attacks them all yet again. But he also acknowledges, right? Too many, and I am too weak. And that's where they say it must not escape. And so as he's essentially fleeing, right, trying to find some measure of protection from himself, that's when Thanos appears and says, there you are, void creature, come for your trophy, have you? Right? And he says, too late, I am afraid. This weapon belongs to Thanos. With that being said, guys, we're going to bring this to an end. And I don't know if you guys noticed, but that dude down at the bottom of Thanos looks like Sinestro from DC Comics. It's clearly not, but it looks like it. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. Thank you all for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.